A good evening, ladies and gentlemen, this is Nerds to Human, and welcome to this slightly different games guide, because really it's not so much a guide to how to mod anything, but it's just really a look at the files and some of the weird things within it. Today specifically, we're going to be looking at the trait bias in Medieval 2 Total War. There are all sorts of traits in Medieval 2, from being ugly or angry, to loathing the French, or even being secretly female. Of course, these traits have a practical sense in giving you extra command, piety, or management for your cities, but it also really adds to the character-led content of the game and aids roleplay. Back when the game was created in 2006, the focus was really still very much on your empire and your armies, but you can see here that the characters are becoming more and more important. And now with Three Kingdoms, we can see the characters really leading the game. For some of us, we love this, some people not so much. But either way, I do think Medieval 2 took a big step towards making the character more and more interesting. Most traits are generated upon their coming of age, is essentially quite random, but it is also influenced by genetics, specifically that of your father and occasionally that of the mother as well. So for example, if your father likes a drink, you have a 50% chance of the son picking up sobriety and a 30% chance of them picking up drink. As the father's trait of drinking increases, the chance of sobriety for the child goes up and up and up. So there's always been an element of genetics in the traits, but this gets more and more extreme in Medieval 2 because we start to see that the very faction they're from makes a big difference. Let's start off with a bit of an example then, and with England we get ourselves a chance of getting brave and ugly. Now, I should say now, there's a chance of anyone picking up these, but for England there's an extra chance of getting ugly, which the only faction who get that privilege, which is just lovely. But if you do know anything about your royalty of England from this kind of period, yeah, the Plantagenet kings of England weren't a particularly good looking bunch, so maybe that's fair. It should be said that ugly isn't inherently a terrible trait. You do actually gain some command, albeit at the cost of some local popularity. Do beware though, as it gets worse and worse, your fertility will start to drop. Just worth bearing that in mind. It's a good example of how some traits, whilst not brilliant, can be used for a certain character. You can just send him out to war and go and bloody everyone's nose. He's pretty good in a battle. Naturally, brave is a good trait as well, and this will actually increase authority and the morale in battle. It's a great trait to have. You can have yourself some very powerful generals when you mix these two together. I'm sure it won't have gone amiss though that these two traits are also here. Hates France and hates Scotland. Pretty much every faction has a chance of picking up an equivalent of this. Actually, the hating faction traits are essentially a good. If you face them in battle, gives you extra command. What you want to make sure you don't do though is lose to them, because then you start getting fears France or fears Scotland, and it kind of works for minus in terms of command. See here, Scotland get hates England, France also get hates England. On the note of hating other factions, it's probably a good time to point out the Moors here, whose abilities are hates Portugal and hates Spain. They don't get anything to do with, I don't know, being brave or liking a drink or being generous or being a good trader or xenophilic or anything like that. They just hate everyone from the Iberian Peninsula. And this brings us to some of the other ones that come up, which I'm a bit curious. We can see here, when you get a random birth from Hungary, you have a chance of picking up anger. And it's the same with Spain. These are the only two factions which get this little trait here. Quite why the Hungarians and the Spanish are seen to be extra angry, I don't really know. Maybe you can illuminate that to me in the comments below, but it is certainly an intriguing one. Another curiosity I've come across is that the Islamic factions seem to get a slightly better deal when it comes to these traits. The Catholics don't actually get their own specific trigger, but Islam does. So any Islamic character has a chance of picking up public faith, which is good piety, mathematics skill, which is extra for trade and for sieging. Cultured gives you authority. Good cavalry general, naturally might imagine good for cavalry. Good administrator, good for trade, good for law. These are all really good traits. So yeah, when we get to the list later, my little table of the best factions, you might notice it's quite Islamic heavy, and that's because they just get the better traits overall. Let's take a little look at the Islamic factions then, because we've got Egypt right here, and again it's just two good traits. Good farmer, good administrator, and these two are going to stack on top of each other. The game is going to check the trigger for, he's Islamic, 10% chance of good administrator. He's Egyptian, let's try again, 10% roll on good administrator. So you are going to get some really good characters through these guys. Let's take a look at some of the other Islamic factions then, because the Moors here, whilst only having hates Spain and hates Portugal, will of course have access to all of those positive traits by being Islamic. so they're in a pretty good place. But it's the Mongols and Timurids who get lots of really good nonsense over here. Eastern Warlord gives you piles and piles of command, good cavalry general, and scout is a nice one to have. It was certainly clear to me during my Timurid campaign that I would get endless 16-year-olds who are masterful warlords, all being pumped out with 5 command already. It does make a big difference when you're leading your forces. You just get good general after good general. Not necessarily good governors, but in terms of the battlefield, you're in for a very good time indeed. Public atheism is by far the worst of all these faction-based traits, but luckily for the Mongols, they never actually pick it up at all. That's because its anti-trait is public faith. Now, public faith, of course, is a 100% chance for all Muslim characters, so this basically overrides it. They never actually pick up public atheism at all. You might notice I didn't mention the Turks, and that's because they have no triggers in the file at all. Of course, everything for them still comes under Islam. They have all of these traits here, which still puts them as one of the better of factions, but it's curious that there's nothing extra for them. But they're not the only faction that has that. Russia and the Papal States also lack any specific triggered traits for their faction, but in a way that's a little bit bizarre, because the Turks have all of these Islamic traits here, but for Orthodoxy and for Catholic characters there's no equivalent, which basically means that when you play as Russia or the Papal States, you just get the random birth chances coming up. Now that does mean they still have a chance of picking up all of these kind of traits like we can see here, but it's interesting that they don't have anything specific. That brings us to the Byzantines then, who are really hard to figure out because corrupt is a terrible trait and pretty much ruins everything, but avoid it, and there are some pretty good traits here. So an intriguing one. Let's have a little closer look at corruption and why it's such a bad trait. Corruption is just truly awful. It is negative on every single level. It's only a 10% chance to get, to be fair, but I would probably just drown anyone who got this. It is not something you can even work with. Before England were a bit hard done by as being the only faction with an extra chance of getting ugly, but ugly at least has some benefits in terms of the command. Corruption is just awful. Down on bribe resistance, down on tax collection, down on law, and it starts to take away loyalty as well. It is quite sad and depressing. No going back from level 2, so you can go back to being more honest if you've only got dubious. I would suggest if you ever pick up the trait dubious, you work hard to try and get them to lose the corruption quickly, because once it gets to level 2 underhanded, it's only going to go bad. If, like me, you're a bit of an anorak and want to know what all the effects are of these traits and how to trigger them in the game, then this is the file we need to be looking at. Export Deska character traits. This is the file I've been looking at throughout this video, and it will tell you all you need to know. To access this, you need to head into the data folder of Medieval 2 Total War. But if you haven't unpacked the files, you won't be able to access it yet. Luckily, if you need any help on unpacking the files, I do a video of that. I'll have a little link in the description below. And in a similar vein, if you want to know more about how traits work, and in general just a more in-depth look at some of the traits in the game, I do have another video on how to gain the authority traits in Medieval 2 Total War. You might want to find that one interesting. Corrupt is very much the bad apple that spoils the bunch, to be fair, because the rest of the traits are good ones. If you can avoid the 10% chance of getting corrupt, then I suppose you're absolutely fine. Just drown anyone who gets it. But actually, otherwise you're in a good place, because Hale and Hearty is a great trait. Hit points up and the fertility up. Only a low chance of 4 getting it. Scotland, Denmark, Sicily, Hungary all get this as well. If you mix that with hating the Turks, bit of extra command, you're not looking at a bad little general. Mathematic skills helps you in a siege, and it also boosts your trade income. Mix that with the minor squalor of aesthetic, and you've got yourself a good governor there. That does actually lower your bribe resistance and lower your command. So I do think when it comes to Byzantines, you've got to be quite fitty. It's a bit of a balancing act. You kind of want aesthetic and mathematic skills. You kind of want Hale and Hearty and Hate Turk to go together. Corruption will just pull it all apart. I guess the real lesson here is that you've got to manage your generals well. Drown all of the corrupt lads, and otherwise you might well have a good chance of doing all right. Here we are then with the Traits League table based on which factions get what, and indeed it must be said the Muslim factions do get the best run of the deal. The Mongols and the Timurids get themselves all sorts of military bonuses along with the general Islamic ones, but Egypt get all the administrative and farming stuff as well. They very much end up on the good side, but there are some Catholics who end up on a good run here. Milan, Portugal, Venice all get themselves trade administration bonuses. Whilst Denmark have an interesting mix of things really. They also have things like Hale and Hearty, but they actually get mathematics skills as well, so they do pretty well out of all this. The factions within the solid category are mainly there because they have a mixture of good and bad traits, likes of Byzantines we've already looked at, but for Scotland for example, they get traits like Miserly, which are good for money and bad for squalor. Overall, it just takes some management, but there are some really good traits within them. Towards the bottom here, we're going to look at some factions who simply pick up some bad traits. I'm going to look at my bottom 5 in a moment. We also get the likes of England and France, who quite frankly just don't get anything particularly useful. Now for me, I probably have a bit of a bias towards the administrative traits. Obviously, all of Venice and Milan, Portugal and the Islamic factions get all sorts to help you manage your cities. But France and England, it's a little bit more to do with the battle. For me, they just don't really do enough. Drink for France can be useful, but goes terrible as it goes on. Ugly is a very similar one. A bit of bonus command just isn't really worth it. As for terrible, it isn't so much that they get awful traits, or so much that they just don't get any at all in the case of Russia and the Papal States. Poland only really get themselves hating factions, or indeed public faith, which for a small bonus of piety just isn't that interesting. Here are my bottom 5 faction traits, and as you may have guessed, corrupt is right at the top. Possibly could have been public atheism, but of course the Mongols don't really get that one in reality. Anger we've already looked at, not a good one as it gets more extreme, and that brings us on to feck. As you might well imagine, feck is all to do with being foul-mouthed, and thus the Scottish are a perfect fit for that bill. It's not actually a terrible trait at the start. Throughout you'll lose piety, which, as long as there aren't inquisitors, isn't the end of the world. Extra command and troop morale is actually quite a good bonus, but as it goes on, yeah, it just gets more and more extreme. Losing chivalry, losing loyalty and authority really is not what you want. Now the Holy Roman Empire have an odd mix of traits. Good ones like stoic and harsh justice are very much counterbalanced by the likes of generous. Negative to trading and tax collection, it's going to hurt your coffers a big deal. It's a bit of a shame in a way because you would think that it would help with your public order. Sadly it doesn't. The same goes for Sicily's trait of xenophilia. It's there very much to represent the multicultural and multi-faith society that they had. But unfortunately it doesn't have any positives. You might like to think that it lowers the unrest caused by religious diversity. Sadly, all it does is make you more likely to be assassinated. Finally then, my top 5 faction traits, and you won't be surprised to see it's dominated by Muslim factions. Cultured, good administrator, mathematics skills, good trader, they're all so helpful for running your city. And I think the reason I'm just a little bit biased towards these traits is because I always fancy myself in a battle. I think even without bonus command or bonus morale, I still think I can pull it off. Now, Hand in Hearty for extra hit points is always useful. You don't want a brilliant general only to get killed by a stray boulder or something. Although, to be honest, an extra hit point won't save you there. But you see my point. I find that's a little bit more helpful than simply the morale or the command. So for me, I think these are the traits that I can't actually make up for in a battle. A good governor is just something that's so valuable in this game. That's all for now then, ladies and gentlemen. I'll leave it to you to battle it out in the comment section as to which faction or traits you think are best and worst. And if you do have any theories as to why these factions have these particular traits, then do let me know, because when I did my video on the guide to authority traits, that's when I noticed anger with both Spain and Hungary. It still intrigued me then, and I'm not entirely sure at this point why it is. Maybe someone with a bit more knowledge of their history can let me know. Nonetheless, I will leave it for now. I hope you enjoyed a little dabble into the files and really just a bit of an explore this time. Maybe we'll make a few more videos in this kind of ilk in future. But for now, I will leave you. This is Thomas, this is Tenacity Human, and this has been a guide to the strange faction-based traits in Medieval 2 Total War. Thank you, and goodbye. Twice baked Italian is on the menu today. Infantry, come kill the Mongol scum. This is just perfect. Look at it. Look at their infantry line. It's been annihilated by their own elephants. Death comes to flying Mongols.